Chers collègues, un grand bonjour à tout le monde. La 9321e séance du Conseil de sécurité est ouverte. L'ordre du jour provisoire de la présente séance est maintien de la paix et de la sécurité de l'Ukraine. L'ordre du jour est adopté. Conformément à l'article 37 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite les représentants du Danemark, de la Lituanie, de la Pologne, de la Roumanie et de l'Ukraine à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite M. Martin Griffiths, secrétaire général adjoint aux affaires humanitaires et coordonnateur des secours d'urgence, à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite son Excellence M. Olof Skog, chef de la délégation de l'Union européenne auprès de l'Organisation des Nations Unies, à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant aborder l'examen du point 2 de l'ordre du jour. Je donne la parole à Monsieur
Martin Griffiths. Madam President, thank you very much indeed, and I'm speaking to you from Geneva. When I last spoke to the Council about the situation in Ukraine in March, I highlighted then the humanitarian impact of the full-scale war, not only on the people of Ukraine, but on the wider world already struggling with a myriad of shocks. In that context, at that time, I emphasized the overwhelming need for a political solution to the war on Ukraine, and indeed peace, to be returned to its people. And I note with regret, therefore, shared, I'm sure, by all in this Council, that hostilities, including missile strikes, currently appear to be escalating on both sides of the front line. Air raid sirens continue to ring out in cities and towns across Ukraine. Civilians continue to seek protection in bunkers, some for days on end. And as Ukraine emerges from a hard winter, civilian casualties are rising to their highest levels in months. The High Commission for Human Rights has now verified a staggering 23,600 civilian casualties since February 2022. And we all know perfectly well that the actual toll is likely to be very much higher than that. Humanitarian impacts are extensive, as those of us who've had the awful privilege to visit Ukraine have seen firsthand. Many communities along the northeastern border with the Russian Federation and near the front line are encircled, cut off from water, food, and medical care by heavy ground fighting and blocked roads. Only last week in Kherson, where I visited some months back. Residential buildings only last week, a school, an outpatient hospital, an elderly care facility were reportedly damaged, leaving scores of civilians needing shelter and health care. The missile strikes in Odessa hit a humanitarian storage warehouse. A Ukrainian Red Cross mobile hospital in Mykolaiv was also hit. Humanitarian supplies and vital medical equipment were destroyed. Fortunately, on those occasions, no humanitarian staff or volunteers were injured, but the threat to humanitarians and civilians represented by the latest wave of attacks, Madam President, is persistent. And of course, I'm compelled once again to recall here to this Council that under international humanitarian law, parties must take constant care to protect all civilians and civilian objects, including homes, schools, hospitals, and other essential infrastructure, as well as humanitarian facilities and assets. And even as though that law is breached, the essential quality of it must be a reminder for all of us. Madam President, as you can see, the humanitarian operating environment remains complex and dangerous. Nonetheless, thanks to the courage of humanitarian workers, particularly and mostly local workers, the United Nations and its partners, its national partners and its international partners continue to deliver life-saving assistance to frontline areas and elsewhere across Ukraine. Nearly 3.6 million people received humanitarian assistance in Ukraine in the first quarter of this year. This includes people receiving cash assistance, receiving food, healthcare, and livelihood support. Around 43 interagency convoys have delivered supplies in heroic moments to around 280,000 people in frontline areas so far this year. This is a particular feature of the humanitarian operation in Ukraine, and I want to pause there for 1 second to pay tribute to those brave people who take those convoys to where they need to be. The partners who then take the commodities from those convoys for the so-called last mile delivery are always, of course, national partners, Ukrainian organizations, and Ukrainian people. There are still limitations on our ability, Madam President, to deliver aid to all those in need. More is needed to take our efforts to scale. The biggest challenge remains the impediments to reaching all areas in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia, currently under the military control of the Russian Federation. The humanitarian notification system, together with direct engagement with key interlocutors in Moscow and Kyiv, a practice that has been in place since the early days of this war. This was set up to maximize the opportunity for safe and unimpeded passage of interagency convoys to those areas. However, despite 14 months of notifying the partners of our intentions through this system, we have not been able to deliver assistance to communities along the front line in areas under the military control of the Russian Federation, not once. Access options to those areas, therefore, including different modalities of response, continue to be explored through engagement with all parties. It is imperative that we do this, that we explore all options to reach civilians wherever they are. As I've said before, under international humanitarian law, all parties must allow safe and rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and must ensure that personnel engaged in that work must have the freedom of movement required for that work. Please, I urge the parties to reinforce and strengthen their facilitation efforts so that we can do that, so that we can reach all civilians in need. Madam President, food exported under the Black Sea Initiative and food and fertilizer exports from the Russian Federation continue to make a crucial contribution to food security at a global level. More than 30 million metric tons of cargo have now been safely exported from Ukrainian ports under that initiative. A quantity which was reached as we were together in Istanbul discussing the future of that initiative just the other day. Of this 30 million metric tons, just over 600,000 metric tons of wheat have been transported by the World Food Programme in direct support of humanitarian operations in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Yemen, places we often discuss in this chamber. The latest FAO analysis indicates that global cereal prices have fallen by close to 20% over the past 12 months. Last month, international wheat prices reached their lowest level since July 2021, driven in part by the continued movement of Ukrainian grain, by large quantities available for export from the Russian Federation and other locations. This is undeniable progress, of course, but much, much more remains to be done. Predictable supplies for humanitarian food assistance operations continue to be required. The initiative refers to the export of ammonia, but this has still not yet been realized. Over the past month, we have also, unfortunately, seen a reduction in the volumes of exports moving out of Ukraine's Black Sea ports due to challenging dynamics within the Joint Coordination Center set up by that agreement of 22nd of July last year in Istanbul, and thus a related slowdown in operations. In recent weeks, and last week in particular, we have engaged in intensive discussions with the parties to the Black Sea Initiative to secure agreement on its extension and the improvements needed for it to operate effectively and predictably. And these efforts will continue and focus in the coming days. In parallel, I pay tribute to Rebecca Greenspan and her team, under Rebecca's leadership, who have continued to deliver a wide range of support with concrete results under the Memorandum of Understanding between the United Nations and the Russian Federation on the facilitation of Russian food and fertilizer exports, so important for international global food security. For the reasons I have set out, I hope you will agree that continuation of the Black Sea Initiative is critically important, as is recommitment by the parties to its smooth and efficient operation. And we will continue to call on all to meet their responsibilities as the world watches us very closely. I want to particularly thank here, Madam President, the government of Turkey, who hosted our talks last week, who brokered the deal, who've hosted us in Istanbul, who've intervened at all levels, at all times, to make this deal be sustained. I thank them very, very much for their efforts, their energy, and their commitment. Madam President, it is clear that the people of Ukraine and millions around the world ill afford the continuation of this war. More than ever, they need an end to hostilities and a political solution to end the conflict. And I am one of those who therefore calls on the Council and all member states to support any efforts that may bring about an end to the carnage and destruction we have seen so clearly, so vividly, and so continuously. In the meantime, Madam President, the United Nations and its humanitarian partners remain committed to safeguarding the life and dignity of persons affected by war and to the pursuit of peace, whether it be today, tomorrow, or in the weeks to come. I thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.
Je remercie M. Griffith de son exposé.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his
Et je donne
briefing,
maintenant la parole
and
aux
I now
membres du
give the
Conseil
floor
qui
to
souhaitent faire une déclaration.
those members of the Council who wish to make
Je donne la
statements.
parole
I give
au
the floor
représentant de la
to the
France.
representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
je remercie Monsieur Griffith pour
I
son
thank
intervention.
Mr. Griffiths for his statement.
Le secrétaire général des Nations Unies
The United
l'a affirmé
Nations
clairement le
Secretary
22
General
février
clearly
dernier,
affirmed the following on the
alors que ce
22nd
Conseil
of
se
February when the
réunissait
Council was
un an
meeting
exactement
exactly one
après le
year to the
déclenchement
date
par la
after
Russie de
the
cette guerre contre
unleashing by
l'Ukraine.
Russia of this war
Je
against
le cite.
Ukraine, and I will quote the Secretary General.
L'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie est
Russia's
un
invasion
affront
of
à la
Ukraine is
conscience
an
collective.
affront to our collective
C'est une
conscience.
violation de
It
la
is
Charte
a
des Nations
violation
Unies et
of
du
the
droit
UN Charter
international.
and of international
Elle
law.
remet en cause les principes
It challenges
et valeurs
the
fondamentaux de
fundamental
notre système
values and
multilatéral.
principles of our
Ses
multilateral system.
conséquences sur les plans
It
humanitaires
is
et
having
des droits humains sont
dramatic
dramatiques.
humanitarian and human rights consequences.
Fin de citation.
End of the quote.
Le bilan de cette guerre
The toll
ne
of
cesse de
this war
s'alourdir.
continues to
Depuis le
rise.
28 avril,
Since the
l'armée russe
28th
a
of April,
repris ses
the
frappes
Russian army
aériennes à
has
grande échelle
resumed its
sur
large-scale
l'ensemble du territoire
airstrikes
ukrainien.
throughout the Ukrainian
L'agression
territory.
russe a déjà
Russian
fait au
aggression
moins 23
has
000
already
victimes civiles,
led
dont plus de 1000
to
enfants.
23,000
Ce chiffre ne
civilian
représente qu'une
victims,
fraction du
including
bilan réel,
1,000 children. This
dans la mesure où
figure
le
only
processus de
represents a
vérification
fraction
se
of the
heurte à
real
d'immenses
toll.
difficultés,
It
notamment à
is
l'impossibilité
difficult
d'accéder
to
aux zones temporairement
verify
occupées
the
par la
figures,
Russie.
particularly
Les
in
journalistes
hard-to-reach,
qui couvrent le
temporarily
conflit avec
occupied
courage pour établir les
zones
faits sont
temporarily
aussi
occupied by Russia.
exposés,
Journalists
comme le
covering the
démontre
conflict
tragiquement
courageously
la mort du
in order to
journaliste français
determine the
Armand
facts have also been
Soldin.
exposed, as we have
Sur le
tragically
territoire
seen with the
ukrainien,
death
près de
of
18
journalist,
millions
French
de
journalist
personnes ont
Armand
besoin
Soldin.
d'une assistance
On
humanitaire.
Ukrainian territory,
La
some
France
18
continuera de
million
témoigner de
people
sa
need
solidarité aussi
humanitarian
longtemps que
assistance,
nécessaire,
and France will
en
continue to show
répondant
its
à ses besoins
solidarity
via son aide
to
bilatérale
the
et dans le
Ukrainian
cadre
people
européen,
as
ainsi qu'à
long as it's
travers son
necessary by
soutien aux Nations
responding to their
Unies,
needs
aux
through our
ONG et aux
bilateral
autres
aid,
acteurs humanitaires.
through our
Madame
European
la
framework,
Présidente,
as well as through our support of the
depuis
United
février
Nations, NGOs,
2022,
and through other
la
humanitarian
Russie a
actors.
perpétré
Madam
d'innombrables
President,
violations du
since
droit
February
international
2022, the
humanitaire et
Russian
du droit
authorities
international
have
des droits
carried
de
out
l'homme.
countless violations of
Certaines
international
sont
humanitarian law and
constitutives
international
de
human
crimes de
rights
guerre,
law.
voire de crimes
These are
contre l'humanité.
tantamount to war
Elle a
crimes,
pris
even crimes against
intentionnellement pour
humanity.
cible la
It has
population et les
intentionally targeted the
infrastructures
civilian
civiles.
population and
Les crimes
infrastructure.
perpétrés contre des
These
civils, les
crimes
tueries, les viols, les
perpetrated
attaques
against
délibérées contre des
civilians,
hôpitaux,
killings,
des écoles, des maternités, les déplacements
rapes,
forcés de
deliberate
population,
attacks against
les
hospitals, schools,
déportations et
maternity
transferts
clinics
forcés
have
d'enfants
led
ne
to
doivent pas rester
forced
impunis.
displacements of
La
the
lutte contre
population,
l'impunité
and
est indispensable
deportations and forced
car il n'y a
transfers
pas
of
de paix
children
durable sans
cannot go
justice.
unpunished.
La France est résolument engagée pour
We
que les
must combat
responsables des
impunity because
exactions
there is no
massives
lasting
répondent de
peace
leurs
without
actes et soient traduits en
justice. France
justice.
is
Elle a
resolutely
récemment
determined
fait
to ensure
don
that those
d'un deuxième
responsible for these
laboratoire
massive
mobile
exactions
d'analyse ADN
in the
à
Russian
l'Ukraine
aggression against
pour
Ukraine
faciliter
will
la
be
documentation de ces
held
crimes.
accountable for their acts and brought to justice.
Madame la Présidente,
It
la
has
guerre
recently made
d'agression russe
a
contre
donation of a
l'Ukraine a sur
second
ce pays et sur
mobile
le monde des
DNA
répercussions
analysis
négatives
lab to Ukraine to
considérables dont la
facilitate
Russie porte
documentation of
seule
these
l'entière
crimes. The
responsabilité.
Russian war of aggression
En
against
envahissant l'Ukraine,
Ukraine
la Russie a
has
aggravé
considerable negative repercussions
l'insécurité
on this
et la
country and on the world,
malnutrition
and Russia
mondiale.
is solely
En
responsible. By invading
restreignant les
Ukraine,
exportations maritimes
Russia
via la mer Noire, la Russie a choisi
worsened
d'exploiter
global
les
security and
vulnérabilités
malnutrition
de
by
certains pays
restricting
aux
maritime
fluctuations
exports
des marchés
via the
des
Black Sea.
céréales.
Russia has chosen to exploit
Nous appelons la
the
Russie à ne pas faire
vulnerabilities of
obstacle au
some
prolongement
countries
des
who are
initiatives
vulnerable
céréalières de la
to
mer Noire
the grain
qui
market
bénéficient aux populations les plus
fluctuations.
vulnérables. La France
We call on
continuera,
Russia not to
avec ses
oppose
partenaires
the
européens,
Black Sea Grain
à
Initiative
intensifier son
benefiting
action
the most
pour
vulnerable
réduire les
people.
risques
France will continue
d'insécurité
with its
alimentaire. Elle
European
le fera
partners to
notamment à travers les
act to
corridors
reduce
de
food
solidarité
insecurity,
de
and we
l'Union
will do this
européenne qui ont permis
primarily through
jusqu'ici
EU solidarity
l'exportation par voies
corridors, which
fluviales et
have
terrestres
allowed for
de
the
plus de
export by
32
land and
millions
sea
de
of
tonnes de
more than
céréales et
32
autres
million
produits
tons of
alimentaires.
grain and other foodstuffs.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
je
President,
conclurai en
I will
citant à
conclude
nouveau
by
le
quoting the
secrétaire
Secretary
général des Nations
General of the
Unies
United Nations once again.
qui n'a eu de cesse de
He
rappeler
has
que la charte
continued
était
to
claire
recall that
et la
the charter
position
is
de
clear
l'organisation
and the
sans
position of
équivoque.
this organization is
La guerre que
unequivocal.
mène la Russie,
The
je cite,
war
n'a
carried
pas de
out by
place
Russia,
dans le
and I
monde
quote,
moderne.
has no place
Elle ne
in our
doit pas
modern
être
world, and
acceptée.
it must not be
Il est
accepted.
grand temps de
It is high
s'éloigner du
time
précipice.
step back from the brink.
Fin de citation. Nous savons
End of
qu'une
the
paix
quote.
juste et durable
We know that a
doit
just
être
and
fondée
lasting
sur la Charte
peace
des Nations
must be
Unies
based on the
et sur
UN
le droit
Charter and
international.
on international
La
law.
France continuera de se
France will
tenir aux
continue
côtés
to
de
stand
l'Ukraine
by
pour
Ukraine
parvenir à celle-ci. Je vous remercie.
to make sure that that
Je
happens.
remercie le
Thank you. I
représentant de la
thank the
France de sa
representative of
déclaration.
France for
Je
his
passe maintenant
statement,
la
and I now
parole
give
au
the floor to the
représentant de l'Équateur.
representative of Ecuador.
Le agradezco, señora presidenta,
Madam
por haber
President,
convocado
I thank you
esta
for having
sesión a pedido de
convened
Francia y el
this
Ecuador.
meeting at the request of France
Agradezco
and
también
Ecuador.
al
I'm also
secretario general
grateful
adjunto de
to
Asuntos
the
Humanitarios y
USG
coordinador
for
del
Humanitarian
Socorro de
Affairs and
Emergencia,
Emergency Relief
señor
Coordinator,
Martin Griffiths,
Mr. Martin
por su
Griffiths, for his
exposición informativa.
very enlightening briefing.
Reitero además el
Once again,
reconocimiento
I
de mi
reiterate
delegación
my
por la
delegation's
valiosa
recognition
labor de OCHA en el
of the
terreno.
valuable work
Y
done by
asimismo
OCHA on the
reconozco
ground,
los
and we also
esfuerzos de ACNUR,
recognize the
el
efforts of the
CICR y las
UNHCR, the
organizaciones
ICRC,
humanitarias en
humanitarian
medio
organizations
de un
as well,
contexto
who are
de
working
máximo
in
riesgo.
a very risky
Llamamos
environment,
a la
and
Federación
we
Rusa
call on the
a
Russian
que facilite
Federation
los
to
accesos
facilitate
seguros en
safe
los territorios que
access
tiene control
to
temporal,
the
como
territory
ha
temporarily
mencionado
under
el
its
señor
control,
Griffith.
as Mr.
Con
Griffiths
una
has mentioned.
quincena
With
de
some
millones de
15 million
personas en
people
situación de movilidad
on the move
entre refugiados y desplazados
between
internos,
refugees and
las
internally
condiciones
displaced
humanitarias
persons,
se
the
siguen
humanitarian
deteriorando
conditions
y
continue
las
to
necesidades
deteriorate,
crecen
and the
debido a la
needs continue to
continuación de las
grow due
hostilidades.
to ongoing
Esta
hostilities.
situación de
This
desplazamiento
situation of displacement
afecta principalmente
primarily
a las
affects
mujeres
women
y niñas,
and girls.
que son las más
They are the
expuestas a la
ones who are
violencia y
most
abusos,
exposed to violence
incluyendo
and
la
abuse,
violencia sexual.
including sexual violence.
Por otro lado, millones de
Moreover,
personas que han
millions of
retornado a sus
people who have
hogares
returned to their
siguen
homes
siendo sometidas a
continue
los
to
desafíos
face the
de los servicios
challenges of
limitados,
limited
la
services,
infraestructura crítica destruida, así como al estrés de la
be
inestabilidad.
exposed to
Nos
destroyed
aflige,
critical
además,
infrastructure, and
que
they
las víctimas
face the
civiles
stress
sigan
of
aumentando,
instability.
con cifras que dan cuenta de
The
miles
figures
de
show
fallecidos y
that
heridos, como
millions
también nos ha
of
referido
civilians
el
have
señor
died and have been
Griffith
wounded.
hace unos
The civilian
momentos.
figures
Insistimos
continue to grow,
en la
as
necesidad
Mr.
de que las
Griffiths has
partes
told us.
respeten
We
y
insist on the need for the
restrictamente
parties to
sus
strictly
obligaciones
respect
que
their
derivan del
obligations
derecho
stemming from
internacional
international
humanitario.
humanitarian law.
Reiteramos además la
Moreover, we
urgencia de poner
reiterate the
fin
urgent need
al uso de
to put an end
explosivos
to
en
the
zonas
use of
pobladas
explosives
y
in
deploramos que las
populated areas,
armas
and we regret the
explosivas
fact that
con
explosive
amplia área de
weapons,
impacto sean la
high
causa
impact
del
explosive weapons, have been the cause of
92.5% de las
92.5%
víctimas
of the
civiles
civilian
en
victims
Ucrania.
in Ukraine.
También nos preocupa
We are
la
also concerned
contaminación por
about
minas y
contamination
remanentes
due
de explosivos,
to mines and
con
explosive
por lo
remnants.
menos 700
With at least
instalaciones de
700
infraestructura crítica dañada o
critical
destruida por la guerra,
infrastructure installations that have been
deploramos que la
damaged or
nueva
destroyed.
escalada de
We
ataques y
regret
bombardeos
the new
en las
escalation of
últimas
attacks
semanas
and bombings
precarice
in
aún más
recent
el
weeks
acceso a los servicios
is
básicos
further
y afecta especialmente a las
jeopardizing
mujeres,
access to
niñas
basic
y
services,
niños.
and again primarily
Nos
impacts
preocupa
women,
la grave
girls, and
crisis
boys. We are
humanitaria
concerned at the
que
very
están
serious
soportando
humanitarian
miles de
crisis
civiles
that millions
por
of
los
civilians are
intensos
facing
combates
due to the
en
intensive
Marinka,
fighting in
Wuhledar
Marinka,
y
Wuhledar,
Kurahove
and
en la
Kurahove
provincia
in the
ucraniana de
Ukrainian
Donetsk.
province of Donetsk.
Expresamos
We
nuestras
express
condolencias
our
a
condolences
Francia
to France
por la muerte del periodista
at the death
francés
of the French
Armand
journalist
Soldin
Armand
de la
Soldin
agencia
from
AFP.
the AFP
El pasado 9 de
agency
mayo,
on the 9th of
en la
May
cercanía de Bakhmut,
near
en el
Bakhmut
este de
in the
Ucrania,
east of
como
Ukraine
consecuencia de las
as
hostilidades.
a result of
con misiles.
hostilities
Esto
involving
suma
missiles.
a la tragedia que el conflicto ha
This has
significado
added to the
también
tragedy which
para
this
el
conflict
periodismo.
has represented
Reconocemos el rol
for
significativo de los reporteros
journalism as
en
well.
la
We recognize the
documentación y
significant role of
difusión de
reporters
la
in
realidad
documenting
de
and
la guerra.
disseminating the reality of the war.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam
distinguidos
President,
colegas,
distinguished
nos
colleagues,
sigue preocupando
we
el
continue to be
espectro
concerned
de
about
una
the
catástrofe
specter
nuclear,
of a
en
nuclear
particular en
catastrophe,
Zaporilla, y
particularly in
llamamos a las
Zaporizhia, and we
partes a
call on
tomar
the
todas
parties
las
to
medidas
take all
necesarias
necessary
para
measures
preservar a la
to
planta
preserve
nuclear de
the
cualquier
nuclear
accidente.
plant and to make
Expresamos
sure
nuestro
that
apoyo
no
a los
accidents
esfuerzos de la
happen. We express
Organización
our support
Internacional de Energía Atómica
for
en la
the
materia e instamos a
efforts
este
of the
Consejo
IAEA,
a apoyar
and we
sin
call on
ambigüedades
this
a la
council
OIEA.
unambiguously to support the
La próxima
IAEA.
semana conmemoraremos
we
el
will
quinto
commemorate
aniversario
the
de la
fifth
resolución
anniversary of Resolution
2417, con la
2417,
cual este
with
Consejo
which this
instó a
Council
todas las
urged
partes
all
a
parties
garantizar el buen
to guarantee
funcionamiento
the
de los
proper
sistemas
functioning
y los mercados de alimentación
of
en
food
situaciones de
systems and
conflicto
markets
armado,
on
a la vez que
conflict
insistió
situations.
a todas las partes a
And we also
proteger a los
urged all
civiles
parties to
y los
protect
bienes
civilians
necesarios para la
and
producción
goods
y distribución
required
de
for the
alimentos.
production and
Por otro
distribution
lado,
of food.
seguimos
Moreover,
lamentando
we
el
continue to
impacto de esa
regret the
agresión
impact
militar
of this
sobre
military
la seguridad
aggression
alimentaria
on food,
global.
global
En este
food
contexto,
security. And in this
hacemos
context,
un llamado a que de ninguna manera
we
se detenga
appeal
la implementación de la iniciativa del
there
grano del
should
Mar
be
Negro
no further
y que por el
opposition
contrario
to
se
the
prorrogue de
implementation of the
manera
Black Sea Grain
indefinida
Initiative,
mientras
and that we
dure
should
el
continue
conflicto.
to extend that initiative
Finalmente,
indefinitely as long as the
insistimos
conflict
en la
lasts. And
necesidad
finally,
de que este
we
Consejo
insist on
y
the
sus
need for
miembros
this Council
se
and its
guíen por las
members
resoluciones
to be
adoptadas en
guided
el
by
periodo
resolutions adopted
extraordinario de sesiones de
during
emergencia de
the
la Asamblea General
General
y
Assembly's special
reiteramos
emergency
nuestra
session,
convicción
and we
de que
reiterate
urge
our
un
conviction
proceso de paz
that we
basado
must
en el
urgently
respeto
begin a peace
irrestricto de la
process
soberanía,
based on
integridad
strict respect for the
territorial
sovereignty,
e
territorial
independencia
integrity, and
política
political
de
independence
Ucrania
of Ukraine,
con miras a
with a
avanzar
view
hacia
to
la
moving forward
reconstrucción
towards
y las
rebuilding
reparaciones de
and
conformidad con el derecho
reparations in
internacional.
accordance with
Muchas
international
gracias.
law. Thank
Je
you.
remercie le représentant de
I
l'Équateur
thank
de
the
sa
representative of
déclaration. Je
Ecuador
passe
for his
maintenant la
statement. I
parole
now
au
give the
représentant
floor
de
to the
l'Albanie.
representative of Albania.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you,
Présidente.
Madam.
I thank USG Griffiths for his update. We pay tribute to his efforts and work, as well as of the entire OCHA team, to meet the humanitarian needs in Ukraine and elsewhere to alleviate the suffering of people everywhere. Colleagues, after 16 months, the special Russian military aggression has stalled on the ground, but it has not stopped, and it has not been less deadly. Beyond casualties and destruction along the front lines, missiles and illegally acquired drones continue their deadly attacks against innocent civilians, their homes, and civilian infrastructure. The USG just shared a sobering account of the latest escalations and their consequences. International law prohibits aiming at civilian buildings, and nothing justifies it, if not to instigate fear. Fear helps authoritarian regimes to impose total control over their people, and fear in warfare is used to terrorize civilians. But the truth is that after 446 days of relentless war, Ukrainians have not surrendered, and all attempts to terrorize them have just made them fight back harder. After 10 months of grueling fleet assaults, Bakhmut tells one of the key stories of this absurd war. If Mariupol became the ugly face of this war and the symbol of brutality, Bakhmut, already a site of tragedy, will be known as the symbol of Ukrainian resistance. Yet, the painful reality is that more than 23,000 civilians have been killed or wounded. Only during the first week of May, OHCHR recorded 221 civilian casualties in Ukraine. Kremlin may keep saying that Russia is not fighting the Ukrainian people. This does not even come close to a bad joke. It is Ukrainian civilians that are dying under the Russian bombs and shells. Those 14 million people uprooted from their homes, those 18 million requiring humanitarian assistance and protection, unable to afford or access enough food, and the thousands of children systematically abducted have one thing in common: they are all Ukrainians. We know now that Russian troops have tortured, sexually abused, and murdered non-combatants in towns they have occupied, like in Bucha. Also, videos have surfaced allegedly showing Russian soldiers beheading Ukrainian prisoners of war. Colleagues, since the beginning of this war, serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law committed in various regions of Ukraine have been duly documented. The findings of the Commission of Inquiry and of the OSCE Moscow mechanism point clearly to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Evidence will one day be presented to the court of law for accountability. But among all the crimes committed in Ukraine, the most incomprehensible and inhuman are those committed against children. Everywhere, in every culture, Children are associated with innocence, and the need for care and protection and crimes against them are seen as particularly revolting, because they are. The forcible mass deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia, disguised under different false names or initiatives, is nothing less than a re-education process in total denial of children's rights. It is indefensible. We expect the yearly report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflicts to include the effects of military aggression in Ukraine, the military aggression Ukraine has had on children. Madam President, this war continues to have implications beyond Ukraine, especially for the global food security. For hundreds of millions of people around the world, food on the table depends also from the continuation and the pace of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We are concerned about reports of activity slowdown, as the USG told us. The number of ships transporting grain has been significantly reduced lately, and any renewal beyond 18 of May seems to go no longer in months, but just in weeks. We know what happens in the world when food is weaponized. Prices go up, there is less food for vulnerable populations, and people go hungry. One does not sit in the Security Council to deny food to those in need. Therefore, we call for the initiative to be extended as part of the global humanitarian response in a way and for a period to provide the necessary assurances and confidence to markets and people. Madam President, 2 days ago in Germany, President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine were awarded the International Charlemagne Prize of Aachen for their fight to defend their country, but also Europe and its values. The contrast could not be more striking. A leader defending its country and its people, fighting for independence, is welcomed, honored, respected, and revered everywhere. Another one, the author of the worst security crisis in Europe for decades, is under arrest warrant by international justice. Colleagues, there is never a bad time to stop a war, especially one that should not have started. Russia must understand that it cannot have its way in Ukraine and that it cannot decide for its people and their future. It would far better be to unconditionally, completely and immediately withdraw from Ukraine, respect its internationally recognized borders. Until this is done, and until reason has prevailed, we will continue to stand in full solidarity with the government and people of Ukraine in the defense of their nation, their land, and our shared values. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Albanie de sa déclaration. Et je passe maintenant la parole au représentant du Mozambique.
Madam President, Mozambique thanks Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths for his update. We commend him and his team for their noble and tireless work worldwide. I wish to acknowledge the presence in this session of His Excellency the Permanent Representative of Ukraine. Madam President, according to the Global Humanitarian Overview 2023 published by OCHA, and I quote, "This year, grinding conflict, the deadly climate crisis, and health epidemics, including cholera and COVID-19, caused record levels of hunger and displacement, worsened poverty, and put equality for women and girls increasingly out of reach. As a result, 1 out of every 23 people worldwide now needs humanitarian relief, more than double the percentage just 4 years ago." End of quote. This is a bleak and terrible scenario, and it is heartbreaking to know that conflicts remain the major driver of humanitarian crisis, and more so in Ukraine. The humanitarian action is an imperative that aims to better address the demands of those in need, particularly in terms of protection and assistance. Madam President, notwithstanding all existing international legal framework that govern the protection of civilians, including the humanitarian dimension, guaranteeing effective protection of civilians in conflicts remains a formidable challenge. It is our principal position that humanitarian work must be given a high priority. In this context, we call on the parties in Ukraine to take urgent measures that can allow for an environment conducive to conditions for aid distribution, safeguards of aid delivery, reconstruction, and fostering long-term peace and reconciliation in the country. We reiterate our urgent call for the belligerent parties to immediately return to direct negotiations conducted in good faith. We believe that peace initiatives put forward by a number of states, including member states of this Council, should be given a chance. Political settlement is the right way to address humanitarian problems. In this context, we agree with EUCG Griffiths that the Black Sea Grain Initiative is critically important. We therefore call for the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is due to expire this week, to be renewed, improved, and expanded in line with the findings of the Secretary General's Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance. And I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant du Mozambique et je passe la parole au représentant de la Fédération de la Russie.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
в начале нашего выступления хотели бы отметить лицемерную подоплеку созыва сегодняшнего заседания Совета Безопасности по гуманитарной ситуации на Украине. В апреле встреч по этой теме не было целый месяц. И никакого интереса к обстановке в этой стране делегации Франции и Эквадора, равно как и другие западные делегации, не проявляли. Зато сегодня мы видим, как члены Евросоюза буквально выстроились в ряд, чтобы для галочки на камеру
to read out their similar statements and tick that box. And this is yet another illustration of the fact that there is no genuine concern with the fate of people who live in Ukraine, and even less with those who live in the liberated territories of Donbass. Western delegations were not concerned about the situation of ordinary people there since 2014 either. Nor will we hear today, unfortunately, any expression of sorrow with the fact that on the 28th of April, Ukrainians once again conducted a horrendous shelling of Donetsk, and they were targeting a regular bus full of people. It burned out completely, 9 people died, including a child. Expertise showed that the shelling was conducted using high explosive missiles for MLRS manufactured in Slovakia. And the same shells are also being used to shell the Donetsk Cathedral during the Easter services.
Слово об этом и у нашего сегодняшнего брифера.
Briefer today didn't say a word about that either.
Как насчет вашей приверженности защите гражданских?
Where is your commitment to the protection of civilians then? Or are these the wrong kinds of civilians?
Ответственность за эти преступления лежит не только на киевском режиме, но и на тех, кто поставляет ему оружие. Более того, с каждым днем, когда в плане накачки Украины оружием, казалось бы, двигаться дальше некуда, поступают новые сообщения о поставках все более тяжелого и изощренного западного оружия. the new heavy and sophisticated weaponry from the West, MLRS, depleted uranium, long-range rocket systems, hundreds of tanks, etc. And we will revert to this issue in the course of the meeting that we requested on this topic on the 18th of May. All this weaponry, which is being provided by some, including member states of Security Council, who are so concerned about the humanitarian consequences of the conflict in Ukraine, this weaponry on a daily basis kills civilians, women and children, destroy health facilities in DPR, Alva, Zaporozhye and Kherson Oblast. The entire military potential of NATO is targeting them, and the Kiev authorities openly boast that legally they have the right to destroy everything that's located in these territories.
Once again, we would like to say this to those who have said that already, will say this later on. The military of the Russian Federation is not fighting the civilians, and it's not subjecting them to targeted strikes, unlike the Ukrainian armed forces. The Western countries are well known for their love to the topic of the issue of combating impunity, especially if this does not cover their own crimes. They think they got away with the millions of civilians killed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and other countries. We are convinced that one fine day they will be held accountable for these. And no threats of sanctions against judges, as was the case with investigations of war crimes by the U.S. in Afghanistan, or intimidating witnesses or investigative reporters downplaying facts, will be of no help then. We can already see that developing countries are rejecting, those developing countries which are neutral of Ukraine, that they're rejecting the pressure being exerted upon them. And we are convinced that they are now tired of justifying every one of their steps and their appeals for peace. Annalena Baerbock recently said that the potential weapons supplies by third countries into Russia are unacceptable because they can be considered tantamount to participation in the conflict. Well, what about the fact that the entire military machine of the West is now fueling the war? This is yet another confession showing the West's participation in the conflict. With the forbearance of Western patrons, Kiev does not shy away from openly terrorist methods either. Amongst its crimes, the terror act against the Crimea Bridge, killing reporters such as Dugina, Maxim Fomin, and the attempt on the life of Zahar Prilevin, as a result of which his friend died. On the 3rd of March, the FSB informed us that they thwarted an attempt on the leadership of the Republic of Crimea. The Ukrainian MOD intelligence was involved in, and the chief of intelligence of Ukraine openly stated that they're ready to kill Russian nationals over the world. And the State Information Agency, Union of Ukraine, after the attempt, published a questionnaire asking who should be next. And if this is not incitement to terrorism, what is it? And how can the people of France, US, and others accept this? They know about terrorism firsthand. How can the Secretary General representative of other international organizations remain silent here? Madam President, we'll hear a lot today about the solidarity of Western community with Ukraine and the readiness to help Ukraine until the very end. But they need to understand that this support will lead the Ukraine to that very end. The external debt in 2022 rose to the level of $132 billion, or 89% of GDP, and it's forecasted that it will exceed 100% of the GDP by the end of the year. The whooping amounts given to Ukraine by the IMF, EU, and Washington, etc., lead it into indebtedness. All of that solidarity is not free of charge, and it will be ordinary Ukrainians who will have to pay back. While the capital is flowing to the country, it's our understanding that its distribution will give to the American company BlackRock, and Kiev signed an agreement to launch a Ukrainian development fund. Under the cover of involving private investments for economy projects, what is happening is a transfer of state sovereignty under external control of a large investment fund with headquarters in New York. We also stated earlier in the Security Council that in the past last 10 years, the amount of Ukrainian arable land, which now under the control of American agro-industrial companies is in excess of 4 million hectares, and the food supplies that were exported from Ukraine within the Black Sea Initiative were not being sent to the use of the starving countries, but for commercial deliveries. The West has always put its interests at the top of the list. So what we're witnessing once again is a turnover circulation of American money in the world. Most of us will return back to Western corporations. Some of it will remain offshore accounts of Ukrainian and American bureaucrats. Some of this, the Ukrainian leaders will not even be able to take with them when they leave the country in a hurry, as was the case with the former president of Afghanistan. The European countries are equally cynical. When the well-being of the farmers in the EU countries came into play, the situation changed. In April of this year, the countries, which because of solidarity corridors ended up with an oversupply of Ukrainian foodstuffs, introduced a ban on imports and in some cases a ban of transit of grain and other foodstuffs from Ukraine. A large part of Ukrainian food remains in the EU, even though they were initially intended for the global south. And this is a very good example of the essence of the humanitarian initiatives for Brussels. Let me recall here that the relaunching of the solidarity corridors was accompanied of measures to liberalize Ukrainian export in the EU. It made it much easier to supply Ukrainian goods to the EU and not the markets of developing states. Madam President, Russia approaches the situation, the food situation of the world very responsibly, despite the fact that the global issues in the area of food security showed up long before the special military operation and were the consequence of the irresponsible monetary policy of Western countries and were worsened by the pandemic. Nonetheless, on the 22nd of July 2022, we positively reacted to the Secretary General's initiative. The main goal here was to ease the situation for food, with supplying foodstuffs and fertilizer to developing countries. A package deal on exporting foodstuffs and ammonia by Ukrainian ports and unblocking the grain and fertilizer export from Russia. But it did not go according to plan. As of the 4th of May, 40% of all production used from the sea humanitarian corridor went into the U.S., and the share of the poorest country here is less than 3%. Less in a year, the agricultural goods from Ukraine are being used by the West. It is only as of the 18th of March, the beginning of the third stage of the initiative supplies in Africa went up by 40%. And this only became possible thanks to the efforts made by the Russian team at the Joint Coordination Center. They were the only ones who fought for and even against the UN to make sure that priority be given to the supplies, to the applications of ships going to Africa. The export of ammonia should have been launched at the same time with grain. This didn't take place. The Ukrainian side in the Joint Coordination Group refused to discuss the unblocking of the ammonia pipeline Toliati-Odessa, which is enshrined in the three-party agreement, came up with newer and newer conditions, which are not part of the initiative. For almost a year, we see that there has been no progress in the second part of the package deal between Guterres and MOU, Russia-UN. The main Russian bank, the Rossельхозbank, which is there to conduct financial transactions on export of foodstuffs, is under sanctions. One-off transactions which were promised by Washington and Brussels are laughable when they are presented as a solution to the problem. The package proposed by the Secretary General is only working on that part which deals with servicing Ukrainian commercial exports. And Russian agricultural supplies continue being blocked by Western sanctions. There are no prospects for their easement under the supposedly exemptions for food and fertilizer. The United States and its satellites basically are imposing the topic that the world is in need of Ukrainian corn for animal feed more than it needs Russian wheat and fertilizer. As we know, last week in Istanbul, four-party high-level talks on the future of the Black Sea Initiative took place, and contacts continue on this. We'd like to recall here that already in March, at the time of the then extension, we warned if there is no progress on the 5 systemic issues blocking Russia agro-supplies, we can't guarantee that the package agreement will be extended.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie et je passe maintenant la parole au représentant du Japon.
Madam President, I thank Mr. Martin Griffiths for his insightful briefing. It is with profound concern that we continue to witness Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine, constituting a flagrant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Russia should stop the war they started. Japan denounces Russia's attacks on civilian infrastructure and urban centers across Ukraine. The attacks on housing complexes, hospitals, schools, energy facilities, and other essential installations for life jeopardizes the welfare and future of the Ukrainian people. We once again recall that indiscriminate attack on innocent civilian population constitute a war crime. There must be no impunity for war crimes and other acts of atrocities. Russia must be held accountable. We further condemn all violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses, urging all parties to the conflict to uphold international humanitarian principles. To restore a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, Japan is committed to the rapid recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine. We will continue to steadily implement humanitarian, financial, and other assistance totaling $7.6 billion to support Ukraine in various fields, including electricity, mine actions, and agriculture. Madam President, challenges we face today are very complex, but Russia's aggression against Ukraine has exacerbated the global food security crisis and caused high inflation. To respond to this urgent issue, the Black Sea Grain Initiative has played a pivotal role in mitigating the repercussions on the world's food supply. The initiative has adeptly facilitated the export of over 30 million metric tons of grain from Ukraine ports, allocating over 56% of these food exports to developing countries. Consequently, the initiative has not only contributed to the reduction of global food prices, but also provided essential support to those severely affected by the war, particularly in developing countries. Japan commends the unwavering dedication of the Secretary General, Mr. Griffiths, and Ms. Greenspan to upholding the initiative's continuity and integrity. We also extend our appreciation to the government of Turkey for their diplomatic and operational assistance to the initiative. In line with the efforts to prevent further deterioration of food crisis, Japan actively contributes to providing emergency food assistance and enhancing the resilience of the international community, including vulnerable member states, and has so far committed over $250 million of assistance. It is truly regrettable that Russia opposed to a 120-day automatic extension of the initiative in March. It is also deeply concerning that since May the 1st, the JCC inspection rate has dropped significantly, indicating not only Russia's unwillingness to facilitate inspections and the movements of ships, but also the intention to suspend the initiative. The prospect of suspension is alarming, as it disregards the potential catastrophic consequences for global food supplies. To avert global hunger and tackle food insecurity, we must ensure the safe and smooth passage of vessels transporting grains, related foodstuffs, and fertilizers from designated Ukrainian ports by sustaining the initiative's operations. Japan calls on all relevant parties, particularly Russia, to act responsibly to ensure the continuation of the initiative. Madam President, the anguish endured by Ukraine and the subsequent strain on global food security must cease. Japan reaffirms its unwavering dedication to providing comprehensive support and standing in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. We pledge to continue our endeavors to secure global food supplies, thereby contributing to stabilizing global markets, preventing poverty, containing social instability, and maintenance of international peace and security. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon et je passe la parole au représentant du Gabon.
Madame la Présidente, je remercie le secrétaire général adjoint Martin Griffith pour les informations qu'il vient de partager avec nous sur la situation humanitaire en Ukraine. Je salue la participation à cette session du représentant permanent d'Ukraine, de la délégation de l'Union européenne ainsi que des représentants de la Roumanie, de la Pologne, de la Lituanie et du Danemark. Madame la Présidente, au seuil du 15e mois de guerre en Ukraine, le bilan de ce conflit meurtrier en termes de pertes, de souffrances et de détresse humaine ne cesse de s'alourdir. Les civils et les infrastructures civiles continuent d'être les cibles des combats meurtriers et de nombreux déplacements de populations consécutifs aux bombardements qui rendent impossible le quotidien des populations innocentes. En dépit d'une solidarité internationale prompte et conséquente, l'aide humanitaire n'a pu parvenir à l'ensemble des personnes dans le besoin, dont les dernières évaluations d'OCHA situent le nombre à 17,6 millions de personnes en 2023, selon les statistiques de la semaine dernière. Nous saluons le travail des agences spécialisées des Nations Unies et toutes les organisations engagées sur le terrain qui doivent faire face à des besoins humanitaires spécifiques et dans des conditions souvent difficiles. Nous reconnaissons leurs efforts pour pourvoir au secours urgent consécutif au bombardement, mais aussi à l'assistance multiforme dont les populations ont quotidiennement besoin dans leur exode ou dans les lieux d'accueil. Nous appelons les parties à faciliter l'accès des convois humanitaires vers toutes les zones d'intervention et en particulier celles qui sont au plus près de la ligne de front, les plus touchées. Les personnes qui ne prennent pas part au combat, et en particulier les personnes vulnérables comme les enfants, les personnes malades ou les personnes âgées, doivent pouvoir accéder aux services essentiels tels que l'eau, l'électricité ou les médicaments. Nous réitérons notre appel constant aux belligérants à respecter leurs obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire, à ne pas cibler les infrastructures essentielles et les populations civiles et à s'abstenir d'utiliser des armes dont les effets indiscriminés infligent des souffrances inutiles aux civils ou peuvent induire une menace durable pour ces derniers, notamment par leurs effets sur l'environnement. Nous soulignons en particulier la nécessité pour les belligérants de s'abstenir de recourir aux mines ou aux armes à sous-munitions ou autres armes téléguidées et à prendre le maximum de précautions en vue de minimiser leurs effets sur les civils et en particulier les femmes, les enfants et les personnes les plus vulnérables. Madame la Présidente, l'ampleur des défis sécuritaires qui se juxtaposent dans plusieurs foyers de tension met à rude épreuve l'élan de solidarité internationale et complexifie la mobilisation humanitaire. Le HCR alerte contre des pénuries de nourriture, d'eau et de médicaments dont les effets peuvent être catastrophiques s'ils ne sont pas très vite endigués. Quant aux besoins de financement du plan d'intervention rapide de la FAO pour l'année 2023 en Ukraine, il est évalué à 205 millions de dollars américains. Dans ce contexte économique mondial fortement impacté par la multiplicité des crises, par la résurgence d'autres conflits armés, par le durcissement de la crise humanitaire, notamment en lien avec une sécurité alimentaire galopante, l'équation paraît avoir plus pour seule issue pertinente d'investir dans le dialogue afin de trouver une solution diplomatique et politique en vue de mettre fin à la guerre. Le prix à payer, aussi bien en vie humaine qu'en reconstruction matérielle, est trop lourd et chaque jour de guerre ne fera qu'augmenter la facture. Mon pays continue et demeure convaincu, que la paix et la coexistence pacifique découleront de négociations de bonne foi entre l'ensemble des parties. L'accord sur les céréales et celui relatif à l'échange des prisonniers de guerre confortent notre conviction. Nous demeurons attentifs et prêts à encourager toute initiative de règlement de conflit par le canal diplomatique. Mon pays reste du côté de la recherche de solutions viables qui permettent de régler durablement le conflit et parvenir à la paix et appelle les parties à s'investir dans des négociations de bonne foi en vue de mettre fin à la guerre meurtrière en Ukraine. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant du Gabon et je passe la parole parole à la représentante du Ghana.
Thank you. Madam President, we are grateful to you as well as France and Ecuador for convening this meeting. We are also grateful to USG Martin Griffiths for his informative briefing. It is regrettable that the war on Ukraine is continuing in a manner that puts at risk the lives of innocent civilians as several cities and towns continue to come under the heavy bombardment of military artillery. For several weeks, intense fighting has held in areas such as Bakhmut, Mariupol, Lysychansk, Popasna, and Severodonetsk, where there are reports of numerous civilian casualties. Only in the first week of this month, OHCHR recorded 221 civilian casualties, with 58 persons killed and 163 injured, mostly by explosive weapons of wide area effects. As is often indicated in the briefings to the Council, these numbers are likely to be higher than those reported. While the casualties have reduced in comparison to previous months, we feel strongly that any civilian casualty is one too many for a war that ought not to have been fought at all. Moreover, both sides have suffered great costs as hundreds of thousands of their men are reported to have lost their lives or been injured at the front lines of the battle. While the turn of the war in coming days is uncertain, what remains unchanged are the obligations of the warring parties under international humanitarian law and human rights laws to ensure the protection of civilians from harm during times of war. In keeping with these humanitarian obligations, we urge the parties to ensure the safe passage of civilians and grant unhindered humanitarian access to all areas where people require assistance, including the occupied territories of Ukraine. We caution against deliberate attacks on civilian populated areas, as well as the destruction of civilian infrastructure, especially energy and water installations, homes, medical centers, schools, and marketplaces, whose destruction heighten the vulnerabilities of civilians and worsen their difficult circumstances. We are grateful for the continuing commitment of the United Nations humanitarian agencies and other partners for their indispensable efforts in placating the impact of the war on innocent lives. We wish to emphasize the importance of making medical, reproductive, and psychological health services accessible to all, especially for the women and children. We thank the leadership of the United Nations and Turkey for their efforts in support of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and join the calls that its further renewal would be helpful in assuaging market commodity concerns. As indicated in today's briefing, the grain deal has been an important stabilizing factor in global food prices over the past year. In expressing our hope for an extension of the initiative, we reiterate our call on the parties and all stakeholders to renew their commitments to ensure its effective operation in all aspects. My delegation further urges relevant stakeholders to make progress in addressing any obstructions to the effective implementation of the MOU on promoting Russian food exports and fertilizers to world markets. Following the recent evacuation of settlements around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, an action that has heightened uncertainty among residents and also abroad, we share in the concerns raised about the staffing conditions at the plant and express our support for the ongoing consultations led by the IAEA to secure the protection of the power plant. We wish to reiterate the absolute necessity of nuclear safety and security in Ukraine, and further reiterate that there can be no winners in a nuclearized conflict. We therefore appeal for such capabilities not to be postured in the course of the conflict in the interest of all humanity. Madam President, we remain resolute in our view that the war on Ukraine cannot be won militarily, and that is why we continue to urge the international community to keep at the forefront of its efforts diplomatic interventions that can help to secure the immediate cessation of hostilities. We believe that it is already past time for the international community to have built on the international consensus for peace in Ukraine in working towards a credible pathway for a comprehensive political settlement in keeping with international law and the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations. We once again call on the Russian Federation to rethink its actions in line with our shared commitments for international peace and security, and to immediately and unconditionally withdraw its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. In closing, I wish to reiterate Ghana's complete commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine as we renew our support for all international humanitarian efforts in aid of the suffering people of Ukraine. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Ghana de sa déclaration et je passe maintenant la parole au représentant du Brésil.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the USG Martin Griffiths for his detailed briefing on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and on the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We regret that the pursuit of military solution to the conflict continues to take an intolerable toll in human lives, like in the airstrikes early this month in Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities, and the increased fighting in Bakhmut just last week. We express our solidarity with the victims. We reiterate our call on all parties to respect and to respect humanitarian international law and the fundamental principles of distinction between combatants and civilians, of proportionality, precaution, necessity, and humanity. Parties must refrain from attacking critical civilian infrastructure. We also emphasize the need for unhindered humanitarian access to those in need, wherever they may be, and to ensure safe conditions for humanitarian personnel, including medical units and equipment. There must be no politicization of humanitarian message, nor selective application of international humanitarian law. Since the start of the conflict, Brazil has defended, alongside with other member states, the immediate cessation of hostilities without prejudging the results of future peace negotiations in order to avoid further violence. That remains our position. Efforts of other member states in this direction are encouraging. We take note of new appeals in favor of dialogue between the parties, which, in our view, is the only path towards sustainable peace. We see the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative as a key step towards building trust between the parties. Brazil encourages the extension of the agreements for as long as necessary in order to limit uncertainties about the global supply of grains and fertilizers. Developing countries dramatically suffered the side effects of the conflict due to their structural vulnerabilities to fluctuations in prices of food and agricultural inputs. The success of the initiative is a collective responsibility. We encourage Russia and Ukraine to reach an understanding and urge other member states to avoid actions that go against the spirit of Istanbul agreements, including with regard to Russian exports of grains and fertilizers. Madam President, we are concerned with the deterioration of the political environment in the Council. We around this table have different perspectives on the conflict's origins and on the way forward, but our understanding of basic international humanitarian law, norms and principles must be shared nevertheless. Brazil cannot avoid but expressing frustration with the Council's inability to find a common ground and approving a resolution calling on all parties to respect international humanitarian law. We also find it regrettable that the conflict in Ukraine contaminates other issues on the international agenda, including in other multilateral fora, by blocking dialogue and making it difficult to find answers to other urgent challenges for which we are responsible. Equally regrettable are attempts mentioned in a meeting earlier this month by the representative of Gabon to force others to choose sides. Defending the UN Charter and international law is a duty of all members, and we support the territorial integrity of Ukraine. However, this principled position should not hamper the work of the Council as a whole towards a peaceful solution. That will require that parties in other member states to be willing to understand the demands and concerns of all sides. The sooner we engage in this collective effort, the better. Thank you.
Le représentant du Brésil, je passe maintenant la parole au représentant des États-Unis.
Representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Undersecretary General Griffiths, for your sobering remarks. First, let me underscore that every day Russia obstructs and threatens to suspend the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Russia raises global food prices around the world. This means higher prices for everyone, poor and middle-income countries, and the UN, which also procures food on the global market. We heard the UN say many times, as we heard from Undersecretary General Griffiths just now, that the initiative is critical to stabilizing global food prices and getting food to the world's hungry. Despite this, Russia has stopped discharging its commitments to the United Nations and Turkey. Russia has deliberately slowed the pace of vessel inspections and severely reduced the amount of grain leaving Ukraine's ports to help meet the needs of the world's most vulnerable. In recent weeks, on more than one occasion, the Russian Federation's delegation at the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul has refused to allow any inspection of ships. Now Russia is threatening to end its cooperation on May 18. And while Russia keeps Ukrainian grain supplies from feeding the hungry, Russia is successfully exporting its own bumper crop of grain. The Russian government regularly cites the need to implement its MOU with the UN on the export of Russian food and fertilizers. In that very MOU, Russia committed to, quote, facilitate the unimpeded export of food, sunflower oil, and fertilizers, unquote, from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Russia must implement its own commitments. Russia must stop holding global food security hostage to its cynical power plays and profit-taking. While we are all paying the increased price for Russia's actions, no one is paying more dearly than Ukraine. After 15 months and countless briefings, unfortunately, we are no closer to ending the humanitarian suffering caused by Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine. Instead, the death toll rises from Russia's missile and drone strikes on Ukraine's civilian population centers. From May 1 through 4, Russia launched more than 145 airstrikes across Ukraine. That translates into an average of more than one missile, drone, or bomb every hour, 24 hours a day, 3 days straight. In just those 3 days alone, Russia's attacks have killed and injured more than 100 civilians, including at least 5 children. Humanitarian organizations have reported worsening conditions in the frontline areas, and necessities such as electricity, food, and fuel are in short supply. President Putin's escalating attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure threaten us all. Russia's obstruction of the Black Sea Grain Initiative impacts the world's hungry. Russia has no interest in mitigating the spillover effects of its war against Ukraine, just as Russia has shown no genuine interest in negotiation or meaningful diplomacy. We call on Putin to stop holding the world's hungry hostage and extend and fully implement the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We again call on Russia to end its attacks on the people of Ukraine and withdraw its forces from Ukraine's territory completely. Russia alone has the power to end the war it senselessly started. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant des États-Unis et je passe la parole à la représentante de Malte.
Thank you, President, and I thank USG Griffiths for his sobering briefing and for the work that he and his team are carrying out on the ground. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine has continued to deteriorate since the last time discussed by this Council. Over the past 15 months, the number of people in need of emergency humanitarian aid and protection has increased from approximately 3 million to nearly 18 million. We state with all the clarity we can muster that this is only the result of Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. Malta strongly condemns Russia's continued escalation of its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Ukrainians continue to suffer deliberate large-scale attacks on critical infrastructure that is indispensable for the survival of the civilian population, and have had their basic services, including energy, water supply, and heating, destroyed by Russian attacks. Continuing attacks on energy infrastructure prompted an energy crisis in the first months of 2023, putting the country's resilience further to the test. Russia has perpetrated indiscriminate killings of civilians, torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment, sexual and gender-based violence, and abductions and forcible deportations of children. In doing so, it has willfully violated the rules-based international order. President, according to the recent report by the International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, the forced transfers and deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia or regions under Russian control are violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes. These children must be promptly returned to Ukraine using technical assistance from international organizations. We demand that Russia stops these unlawful deportations and comply with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We also welcome and encourage further efforts to ensure full accountability for all crimes committed by Russia against Ukraine and on Ukraine's territory. In light of this, we are supportive of the ongoing ICJ and ICC processes. Malta strongly believes that there can be no peace without justice. In this regard, Malta joined other state parties of the ICC in making a referral to the court on the situation in Ukraine and will continue its efforts to strengthen the cooperation between the ICC and the Security Council to keep investigating the Russian crime of aggression. Malta is a strong supporter of the ICC as a beacon of accountability. We take note of the warrant issued against President Vladimir Putin and the Russian Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. We are firm in our belief that crimes committed must not go unpunished and that all perpetrators must be held accountable. Malta will continue to support all efforts to address the humanitarian consequences of Russia's aggression. We also reiterate that the only step towards a just and lasting peace would be for Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and, unconditionally, completely withdraw all of its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I conclude by highlighting the importance of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which extends beyond Ukraine and affects global food security. It is paramount that the agreement is further extended between all parties to alleviate pressures on security of supply affecting communities throughout the world. This is yet another element that needs to be pursued as part of the collective efforts to secure sustainable and lasting peace. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Malte et je passe la parole au représentant de la Chine.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I thank USG Griffiths for his briefing just now. The Ukraine crisis is still dragging on. The humanitarian situation remains extremely dire, and the spillover effects of the crisis continue to manifest themselves. The international community should take positive steps to mitigate the humanitarian consequences of the conflict and make joint efforts for the de-escalation of the situation and an early cessation of hostilities. First, every effort should be made to reduce the harm and suffering done to civilians. The international humanitarian law provides for the code of conduct that must be observed in situations of conflict. Parties to the conflict should spare no effort in protecting the safety of civilians and civilian facilities. Women and children are the most vulnerable groups in armed conflicts and must be given special attention. We welcome the expansion of aid to all affected populations and the facilitation of repair and restoration of civilian infrastructure by the international community, including humanitarian agencies, on the basis of neutrality and impartiality. China supports the balanced, full, and effective implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the MOU on the export of Russian food and fertilizers, and supports the UN in playing an important role in this regard to remove the real obstacles facing the export of Russian food and fertilizers. Second, the red line of nuclear safety must never be crossed. Nuclear weapons must not be used, and nuclear wars must not be fought. The safety and security of nuclear power plant facilities in Ukraine concern the safety and well-being of hundreds of millions of people. Any accident could cause incalculable humanitarian and ecological consequences. We call for maximum rationalness and restraint, and for avoiding words and deeds that could exacerbate confrontation and lead to miscalculations. China supports the Director General of IAEA in maintaining communication with Russia and Ukraine, and in playing a crucial role in safeguarding the safety and security of civilian nuclear facilities. Third, the spillover effects of the conflict response measures should be taken seriously and managed. The world economy is faced with renewed risks of recession, which calls for the coordinated actions by all countries to jointly keep global food, energy, and financial markets stable. However, one round of unilateral sanctions after another and ever-expanding long-arm jurisdiction have not only led to severe humanitarian consequences, but also undermined the global industrial and supply chains. The U.S. and other relevant countries should seriously reflect upon their behavior, immediately mend their ways, and create conditions for developing countries to grow their economies and improve livelihood. They must refrain from engaging in economic coercion on one hand, and on the other, cooking up narratives accusing other countries of economic coercion. Unilateral sanctions have no basis in international law and are drawing the aversion and opposition from a growing number of countries. It must be pointed out that the so-called rules-based international order is likewise highly problematic in legal and practical senses. They are no excuse for the U.S. and other relevant countries to abuse unilateral sanctions and hardly enjoy broad support or recognition from the international community. Fourthly, and most fundamentally, the greatest sense of urgency is needed for the political settlement of the crisis. There are no simple answers to complex issues. Any comprehensive solution always begins with the first step, and the resumption of dialogue and negotiation cannot wait indefinitely. All parties should create conditions for advancing dialogue and negotiation, instead of adding fuel to the fire and escalating tensions in an attempt to profit from it. On the Ukraine issue, China has always been on the side of peace, and everything we do is for the promotion of talks for peace. Ambassador Li Hui, Special Representative to the Chinese government on Eurasian affairs, has left today for visits to Ukraine, Poland, France, Germany, and Russia to engage with all parties on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. We stand ready to work with the international community in the continued and tireless efforts towards the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de la Chine de sa déclaration et j'invite la représentante du Royaume-Uni à prendre la parole.
Thank you, President, and I join others in thanking Under-Secretary General Griffiths for his briefing and work on the ground. And your briefing today, Under-Secretary General, reminds us of the enormous cost of Russia's war of aggression. Russia has continued to conduct massive missile and UAV strikes against inhabited areas across Ukraine, killing innocent civilians. The UK is appalled by reports of recent Russian attacks on the Ukrainian Red Cross warehouses in Odessa and on a mobile hospital in Mykolaiv.
there is no excuse for attacking the most vulnerable or the brave humanitarian workers who are supporting them. So we call on Russia to abide by international humanitarian law, in particular to observe the distinction between combatants and civilians. Ukrainian civilians, indeed all civilians, should be protected by all combatants. Similarly, aid organisations and aid workers, whose mission is to help innocent civilians in humanitarian need, are not a target. In Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, an estimated 4 million people are living in dire, forlorn conditions. Despite regular attempts by the UN to gain access to deliver humanitarian support, Russia has never provided the necessary security guarantees for access. We continue to call for unimpeded and sustained humanitarian access to the people of Ukraine. We call on Russia to stop denying access and cease its attacks on critical infrastructure and residential areas. President, as we've heard from others, the BSGI is critically important. Over 30 million tons of grain and other foodstuffs have been exported under the initiative since the 1st of August. The deal has been critical to lowering global food prices and getting urgently needed grain to countries that need it most. As the World Food Programme has said, grain deliveries to any country drive global prices down. So we urge Russia to stop threatening to leave the initiative and instead to agree to a sustained and stable deal. In the meantime, Russia continues to block and delay ship inspections. This obstruction harms global food security by delaying shipments, restricting supplies, and keeping prices high for food importing countries. Finally, President, the UK is fully committed to holding Russia to account for its illegal actions in Ukraine. We will continue to support independent investigations into the atrocities committed in Ukraine as part of a just and sustained peace. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Royaume-Uni et je passe la parole à la représentante des Émirats Arabes Unis. Madam President, I would like to join others in thanking Under-Secretary General Griffiths for his informative briefing today. Mr. Griffiths, your sobering report is not only a reminder of the importance of why we are here, but what we must do our utmost to avoid, losing our sense of urgency surrounding this conflict. Neither should we stand idly by as this war transforms into a protracted conflict of several years. The consequences are too grave for all of us. Yet fighting has been continuous and unending, with the price being paid by civilians who bear the brunt of the suffering. The scale of devastation and the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine cannot be truly conveyed in the numbers we have heard today. In the past 14 months of war, there have been over 23,000 verified civilian casualties, and the actual figure is likely to be considerably higher. 18 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, more than 8 million people are refugees across Europe, and an additional 5 million people have been displaced inside Ukraine. Humanitarian access must therefore be ensured in order to allow much-needed aid to reach civilians caught in the fighting. In recent weeks, there has been a noticeable uptick of missile and drone strikes that have damaged or destroyed civilian infrastructure. Humanitarian facilities have been hit. Last week, a Ukrainian Red Cross warehouse and mobile health clinic were destroyed. We once again reiterate our call on the parties to the conflict to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law. Civilian objects must never be the target of an attack. The UAE continues to provide humanitarian assistance to those impacted by the conflict, including a donation of ambulances recently. We also continue to support civilian energy needs. We have sent 2,500 generators and are sending additional energy-efficient power supplies in the coming period. Madam President, the war in Ukraine has had far-reaching consequences beyond the battlefield, as the ripple effects have exacerbated global food crises. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has proven vital against this backdrop. The world has seen the safe export of over 30 million metric tons of grain and foodstuffs from Ukraine since the beginning of the initiative. These efforts thus far have successfully contributed to alleviating the mounting pressure on global food prices and the inevitable knock-on effects of a destabilized food system on the world's poorest. We are encouraged that this vital initiative continues and commend the earnest efforts of the United Nations and Turkey to bring all parties to the table in order to find solutions on the outstanding issues. And we're pleased to hear that the UN will continue to work closely with all sides to ensure the smooth operation of the BSGI. At the same time, we continue to call for the full implementation of the MOU on Russian fertilizers and food products and continue to support efforts to this end. While the importance of the Black Sea Grain Initiative is widely appreciated for its practical benefits, in reality it is also, we hope, a trust-building mechanism. Reaching an agreement again on this initiative and other successful negotiated outcomes, such as exchanges of prisoners of war, demonstrate that there remains some degree of willingness to negotiate a pathway forward. We are cautiously hopeful that such efforts can be a conduit for building trust between all parties and may serve to remind all parties of the benefits of peace. Madam President, the UAE has consistently held that there is no viable military solution to this war, and we will not waver in this belief. We call for de-escalation, diplomacy, and dialogue as the way forward. The international community should rally behind all efforts that lead to the cessation of hostilities and pave the way for a just and lasting peace, one that respects Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie la représentante des Émirats arabes unis. Je vais maintenant faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentante de la Suisse. Je voudrais commencer par remercier le secrétaire général adjoint Martin Griffiths, non seulement de son exposé, mais aussi de tout son travail et du travail de ses équipes, tant en Ukraine que par rapport à l'Ukraine. Au mois de mai, ce Conseil met traditionnellement l'accent sur la protection de la population civile, obligation juridique pour toute partie à un conflit armé. Et pourtant, après 15 mois de guerre, nous devons constater que la population civile en Ukraine continue de payer un prix bien trop douloureux. Ces derniers jours, la population ukrainienne a dû subir à nouveau de multiples vagues d'attaques. Des missiles et des drones russes ont frappé différentes régions d'Ukraine. À Kherson, des attaques ont touché une gare et un supermarché durant les heures de pointe. Ils ont tué ou blessé des dizaines de personnes. À Odessa, l'entrepôt de la Croix-Rouge ukrainienne a été détruit, de même que sa clinique mobile à Mykolaiv. À Ternopil, un entrepôt humanitaire a également été détruit par des frappes russes samedi dernier. La Suisse condamne fermement ces attaques. Je réitère encore une fois, les personnes et les objets civils ne sont pas des cibles. Nous appelons au respect du droit international humanitaire. Les parties au conflit ont la responsabilité de prendre toutes les mesures possibles pour protéger la population civile. Nous rappelons également l'obligation de protéger les travailleuses et travailleurs humanitaires et d'assurer leur accès sans entrave aux près de 18 millions de personnes dans le besoin en Ukraine, y compris celles qui se trouvent dans les zones occupées par la Russie. Par ailleurs, la reddition des comptes est un impératif pour rendre justice. La commission d'enquête internationale indépendante sur l'Ukraine a conclu en mars dernier que certaines violations du droit international commises en Ukraine constituent des crimes de guerre. Les auteurs de ces crimes et d'autres violations du droit doivent répondre de leurs actes. En même temps,
Il est essentiel de placer les besoins des victimes au centre de tous les efforts de justice transitionnelle. Nous soutenons la recommandation de la commission d'enquête selon laquelle il faudra mettre en place des instruments complémentaires tels qu'un registre des victimes, des réparations et des services de santé mentale et psychosociaux. Excellence, l'agression militaire russe contre l'Ukraine a des répercussions négatives dans le monde entier. C'est là qu'entre en jeu l'initiative de la mer Noire, ainsi que le protocole d'accord axé sur l'exportation de produits alimentaires et d'engrais russes. L'initiative contribue à atténuer l'insécurité alimentaire et énergétique. La semaine dernière, elle a franchi un seuil important avec l'exportation de 30 millions de tonnes de céréales et de denrées alimentaires depuis son lancement. Parmi celles-ci, plus d'un demi-million de tonnes de céréales ont été expédiées par le Programme alimentaire mondial à l'appui de ses opérations humanitaires en Afghanistan, en Éthiopie, au Kenya, en Somalie et au Yémen. Au vu de sa valeur ajoutée, l'initiative de la mer Noire doit se poursuivre. Nous encourageons toutes les parties à redoubler d'efforts afin de trouver une solution durable. Nous saluons l'engagement du secrétaire général et de ses représentants et la contribution de la Turquie à cet égard. La Suisse se tient prête à apporter son soutien, notamment dans son rôle d'État hôte. Excellence, après 15 mois de guerre, des milliers de civils souffrent des effets directs dévastateurs de ces hostilités, ainsi que des effets indirects sur les infrastructures indispensables pour subvenir à leurs besoins fondamentaux. Nous réitérons notre appel urgent à la Russie à entamer immédiatement une désescalade, à cesser toutes les opérations de combat et à retirer sans délai ses troupes de l'ensemble du territoire ukrainien. J'espère que ce mois de mai, marqué par l'esprit des conventions de Genève, nous amènera à réaffirmer ce qui devrait toutes et tous nous unir, l'impératif humanitaire de protéger la population civile. Cela vaut en Ukraine comme partout dans le monde. Je vous remercie. Je reprends maintenant mes fonctions de présidente et je donne la parole au représentant de l'Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary General Griffiths. I also recognize the representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. We meet to address the Russia's war against my country after one of the lowest periods in the history of this Council, the April presidency of the aggressor state, which inflicted yet another blow on an already compromised principal body of the United Nations. This April alone, the Russian occupiers committed 6,139 war crimes. These crimes led to the death of 207 Ukrainian civilians, including 11 children. On the 28th of April, Russia again launched a missile strike on a multi-story apartment building, this time in Uman, Cherkasy region. As a result, 23 residents were killed, including 6 children. So much about Putin's envoy saying that they do not attack the Ukrainian civilians. Many of you have seen the heartbreaking video footage from Uman, where people desperately waited for hours near the rubble for their loved ones to be retrieved. In Russia, the TV audience watched this footage on the state propaganda channel Russia 1. Meanwhile, the Russia's Ministry of War posted on social media, "Right on target." Indeed, since day one of the Russian invasion, regardless of the torrent of lies from the Russia's representative in the Council, innocent civilians have been a deliberate target for Russian weapons and a permitted object for Russian crimes. Russism and its disciples, including in this chamber, have defied logic, all laws of non-contradiction, and all semblance of decency. 2 days later, on the 1st of May, another Ukrainian child, a 14-year-old boy, was killed in the village of Lizunivka, Chernihiv region, by a Russian air bomb that also destroyed the local school. This attack was another case of the cowardly and despicable terror tactics that the Russian army applies widely against the northern Ukrainian regions liberated a year ago. Air bombing of Ukrainian border settlements from Russian airspace. Just like any other terrorist, the Russian servicemen do not care where these bombs finally fall. The main thing is that they must sow death and destruction. Terror against the liberated areas has become a hallmark of the Russian army. On the 3rd of May, in Kherson region alone, Russia killed 23 people. 49 were wounded in a store, railway station, gas station, their homes. On the 7th of May, a Russian missile strike damaged a mobile hospital in Mykolaiv region, which also belonged to the Red Cross of Ukraine. Since the beginning of the full-fledged Russian invasion, 25 facilities of the Red Cross of Ukraine have been damaged or destroyed. On the 9th of May, a massive barrage of 25 missiles slammed into the Ukrainian cities. The day before, on the 8th of May, Ukrainian Air Force were able to down all 35 Iranian drones launched by Russia. Also, on the 8th of May, Russian missiles completely destroyed a warehouse of the Red Cross of Ukraine in Odessa, with all the humanitarian aid there. One employee was killed. As a result of the attack, Odessa branch of the Red Cross of Ukraine was compelled to suspend the provision of humanitarian aid and the implementation of a number of humanitarian projects. We are grateful to our friends and allies who literally saved the lives of Ukrainians by helping us to reinforce our air defense. This enabled us to shoot down 23 out of 25 missiles. Yet more needs to be done to fully protect our skies and civilians. This weekend, Ukrainians also had to spend their time with air raid sirens sounding in the background as Russia launched massive new attacks using dozens of Iranian drones, cruise missiles, and S-300 rockets. The cities of Khmelnytsky, Ternopil, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and Konstantinivka in Donetsk region suffered human casualties and serious damage to civilian infrastructure. Colleagues, in addition to the immediate harm caused to millions of Ukrainians by the Russian war, the long-term effects of displacement, trauma, and poverty will be felt for years to come. The most vulnerable suffer the most. Russia is violating the fundamental principles of child protection in wartime. As a result of the Russian aggression, 480 children have been killed and 967 injured. To date, 13 cases of sexual violence against children have been verified by the Office of Prosecutor General of Ukraine in Donetsk, Kyiv, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Chernihiv region. The real numbers are definitely higher, and our law enforcement continues the investigation. Russia's attacks have damaged 3,185 educational institutions, of which 330 were destroyed. In total, 1,412 healthcare objects and 577 healthcare facilities have been damaged, of which 258 facilities were destroyed. According to UNICEF country team report, education for an estimated 5.7 million children has been disrupted. 1.5 million children face mental health issues. The forceful deportation of children is nothing but a well-planned Kremlin policy aimed at aggressive indoctrination, ethnic identification change, and the deprivation of Ukraine of its future generation. To date, the Ukrainian authorities have identified 19,393 children deported or abducted to the Russian Federation, or to the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia. Nearly 4,390 of them are orphans or children without parental care. It has been possible to return only 364 children. We note with concern that Russia has reportedly intensified its deportation and abduction practices in the occupied territories under the guise of so-called evacuation. Like many of you in this Council, we reiterate that it is only the Russia's troops that must be evacuated from the territory of Ukraine. As soon as this happens, the atrocities of war will be over. We welcome the well-founded conclusions of the reports by the Commission on Inquiry on Ukraine, established by the Human Rights Council, and by the OEC Moscow mechanism that have reconfirmed the enormous scale of violations and crimes committed by the Russian occupiers, in particular against children. We call on the Secretary General and the Special Representative on Children and Armed Conflict to give a proper assessment of the gravity of violations against children in Ukraine by the Russia's government forces in the upcoming annual report. We believe that this report should contribute to ensuring accountability for perpetrators and justice for Ukrainian children, victims of the Russia's aggression. The invasion of the Soviet permanent seat in the Security Council should give neither immunity nor amnesty to war criminals. Madam President, we have already brought to the Council's attention the critical situation with mine contamination of Ukrainian lands. According to preliminary estimates, 170,000–180,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory are contaminated with mines and other explosive ordnance. Our primary task today is to accelerate the demining process as much as possible, increase the number of demining teams, and equip them with special equipment. Unfortunately, those people who risk their lives to clear Ukrainian territory from mines and restore safety for people are also a target for the Russia's troops. Most recently, on the 7th of May in Kherson region, 9 members of a demining team were killed by Russian shells while on duty. The mine contamination in Ukraine is an issue for global food security, as more than 4,700 square kilometers of contaminated areas are agricultural lands. In such extraordinary circumstances, Ukraine continues to act as a reliable contributor to global food security by implementing its agreement with the United Nations under the Black Sea Grain Initiative and advocating for expanding its geographical scope by including new Ukrainian ports. As of the beginning of May, Ukraine exported 29.8 million tons of grain and foodstuffs. This number includes 600,000 tons of grain shipped by vessels chartered by the World Food Programme in support of its humanitarian operations in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Yemen. This volume could have been significantly higher if Russia did not resort to impeding practices. We are concerned that since the 1st of May, the inspection rate has dropped to an average of 2.9 inspections per day, compared to 6.6 in the period of August 2022–April 2023. As a result, in April, we were able to export through the grain corridor less than 3 million tons, which is only a half of our agricultural export capacities. Together with the United Nations and Turkey, Ukraine strives for the extension of the initiative without any delay and disruption to shipments. According to experts, if it is blocked by Russia, the global food prices could increase substantially again. This grim perspective should be taken seriously. It is disgusting that Russia still pretends to be on the losing side of the deal. I will not even remind the Council of the immorality of such complaints from the aggressor state, which has been and remains the only threat to food shipments in the Black Sea. Let us just turn to the data that clearly shows the benefits for Russia from the deal. The data indicates that Russian wheat export in January-February 2023 nearly doubled from the same period a year earlier. We therefore consider these speculations to be an attempt to whitewash Russian deliberate practices to weaponize food supplies, and we urge the international community to give a resolute response. Let me remind some statements here. Black Sea Grain Initiative is not due to expire this week. It is, however, the Russian blackmail deadline that expires this week. Madam President, a week ago, we paid tribute to the victims and heroes of the Second World War, marking the end of this war in Europe. The atrocities of this war prompted our predecessors to commit themselves to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Now in Ukraine, Russia reminds us that our commemoration slogan, "Never Again," is still a goal to be achieved. The lessons of the Second World War teach us that just and lasting peace can only be possible if evil is defeated and is not able to continue its aggression. Any attempt to appease the aggressor at the expense of its victims will only protract and broaden the scope of the tragedy. As my president said on the 8th of May, when Ukraine, along with the entire world, commemorated the victory over Nazism, we in Ukraine give meaning to these words, "Never again," not only to remember, but also to protect, not only to value life, but also to do the utmost to ensure that everyone who threatens life, everyone who brings aggression, everyone who resorts to terror against other nations, every such evil loses. Ukraine has committed to stop this modern evil of Russism. We are guided by the supreme principle of morality that is a categorical imperative, since it is not conditional upon one's preferences. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Ukraine de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à son Excellence Monsieur Lotskog, chef de la délégation de l'Union européenne auprès de l'Organisation des Nations Unies.
To the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova and Bosnia-Herzegovina, the potential candidate country Georgia, and the EFTA country Liechtenstein, member of the European Economic Area, as well as Andorra and Monaco, all aligned themselves with this statement. And I want to, like everyone else, first thank very much Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths for the briefing, and also, of course, to commend you and the UN system for the excellent work that you are doing on the ground, providing humanitarian assistance under very difficult circumstances in Ukraine and in many other places. The horrors that you, Mr. Griffiths, and others have described from inside Ukraine, resulting from Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression, are unimaginable. For 15 months now, the Russian leadership has struggled without success to find any justification whatsoever for its illegal war of aggression. Russia must stop its war and immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its forces and proxies from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Madam President, I will emphasize 3 points in my intervention. First, the importance of upholding international law and international humanitarian law. Second, the need for accountability. And third, efforts to address the global consequences of Russia's war of aggression. First, international law and international humanitarian law must be respected. Therefore, Russia must immediately stop its indiscriminate and decimating shelling of civilians and civilian areas. Under international humanitarian law, deliberate attacks on civilians or attacks that do not distinguish between military targets and civilians are prohibited under all circumstances. We strongly condemn cases related to sexual and gender-based violence. We are particularly horrified by the impact of Russia's aggressions on children. Children have been killed and maimed. Schools and hospitals have been attacked in blatant violation of international law. Russia's practice of forcibly transferring and deporting Ukrainian children is a violation of international humanitarian law. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine concluded that it amounts to war crimes. Russia must immediately facilitate the safe return of Ukrainians who were forcibly transferred or deported. We also strongly condemn Russia's attacks and violence against journalists and media workers. UNESCO has stated that 12 journalists were killed in Ukraine since the start of the invasion. Journalist safety is indispensable to ensuring the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and in particular, the freedom of the press. We urge Russia to enable safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to populations in need of assistance, in particular into the temporarily occupied territories through the front lines. It is imperative that the safety of humanitarian workers is ensured. Second, there can be no impunity for the commanders, perpetrators, and accomplices of atrocities. The EU is firmly committed to ensuring full accountability for war crimes and the other most serious crimes committed in connection with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, including through the establishment of an appropriate mechanism for the prosecution of the crime of aggression. We welcome the creation of the new International Center for Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine in The Hague, and we reiterate our support for the investigations of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. We're also fully supportive of the establishment of an international mechanism to register the damages Russia has inflicted, as recommended by the UN General Assembly in its resolutions of November 2022. Third, Madam President, Russia's aggression and its weaponization of food have undermined global food security, driving up food and fertilizer prices worldwide. We welcome the Secretary General's active engagement to address these serious consequences, and we call on all Member States to come together in support of his efforts. They benefit us all, including Russia. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, in particular, has been instrumental in bringing down global food prices. It is crucial that it is renewed and runs at its full potential to provide continuity and predictability needed by operators and to avoid a discontinuation in shipments of grains to countries in need. We must not forget that there would be no need for this initiative if it were not for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. In addition to the Black Sea Initiative, the EU's solidarity lanes have allowed the export of more than 32 million tons of Ukraine's food and agricultural goods. World Food Programme chartered vessels have transported almost 600,000 tons of wheat through various Black Sea ports, including to Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Kenya. Through Ukraine's own Grain from Ukraine program, hundreds and thousands of metric tons of grain have been donated to countries in need, as we just heard. We know these efforts are still insufficient for countries vulnerable to food insecurity. Therefore, together with our member states, we are providing 18 billion euros to address urgent and longer-term food security needs in 2021 to 2024, focusing on regions most affected by food insecurity. Concretely, this support enables vulnerable countries to afford key staples imports despite price increases and currency devaluations, as well as to increase their resilience and food autonomy in the longer term. I want to reassure the members of this Council that every effort in support of Ukraine has come in addition to, and not instead of, our global commitments, as illustrated by the increase in EU official development assistance. We're grateful to all countries who are generously supporting those in need in Ukraine and elsewhere, and once again encourage all to step up their assistance in line with OCHA's humanitarian response plan and appeal for aid for this year. Madam President, in closing, I reiterate our call for just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and the General Assembly resolution adopted in February. The EU is unwavering in our support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and its inherent right of self-defense against Russia's aggression. we will continue to stand firmly with the Ukrainian people for as long as it takes. I thank you very much.
Je remercie son Excellence, M. Skok, de sa déclaration et je passe maintenant la parole au représentant de la Roumanie.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I also want to thank Ecuador and France for requesting this meeting, and thank you for convening it. I also want to appreciate the opportunity that we are provided to address the Council. In addition to the points made by the EU Ambassador, I would like to add several points. And Undersecretary General Griffith provided a sober overview of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. I want to take the opportunity to thank, indeed, to pay tribute to the efforts of the Undersecretary General and his team to address the multiple challenges provided by this aggression. Sadly, the civilians are still the ones that pay the price of the illegal aggression of Russia and Ukraine. This is day number 446 since the aggression. International law and international humanitarian law must be respected, and this is a red line agreed by the entire UN membership. And yet, the new barrage of rockets towards Ukraine provides no indication that Russia has any intention to stop its indiscriminate shelling of civilians and civilian areas. Ironically, next week we are to celebrate at the UN the Week of Protection of Civilians. The ruins of urban and rural areas are in sharp and painful contrast with SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities. There could be no more direct connection between development and security than this one. Later this year, we are expected to take stock of the Agenda 2030 at the SDG Summit in September. And the Russian invasion and the continued aggression towards Ukraine also hamper our efforts towards the 2030 Agenda, in addition to the blatant violation of the principles of international law and international humanitarian law. Madam President, since the beginning of the year, the international community has sent strong messages regarding the predictability of accessing food around the globe via the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We welcome the continued efforts undertaken by the Undersecretary General Griffith and Undersecretary Greenspan, and those of Turkey in keeping BSGI alive. We need this initiative to move forward. We need predictability. We need responsibility. We are too far in implementing BSGI to go back and risk an aggravated global food crisis. There is no time for second thoughts. As we heard it today, there should be no plan B to BSGI. On its part, Romania will continue to rise to the expectations and facilitate the exports of grains from Ukraine to reach those in need via the EU solidarity lanes. And so far, over 16 million tons of grains crossed the Romanian territory, mainly through Romanian Black Sea ports, in addition to the amounts already used through the BSGI. Madam President, in line with the resolution adopted by the General Assembly on the 23rd of February this year, Romania will continue to call for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Likewise, we should also be mindful of the danger of impunity of those responsible of crimes committed in connection with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Alongside the Russians that undertake abuses and violation of human rights and international humanitarian law provisions, the March report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine recommends to the Russian Federation to limit the use of private military and security companies as they are, quote, generally less accountable than regular forces, unquote. Romania firmly believes that justice must be done with regard to all core crimes committed in the context of this war. All core crimes, including the crime of aggression. While this is not an easy path, we should rise to this challenging task rather than be discouraging. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de la Roumanie et je passe maintenant la parole au représentant de la Pologne.
Madame la Présidente, Poland appreciates the convening of this timely and very needed meeting. We value the opportunity to contribute to the discussion, triggered once again by the new distressful facts regarding the humanitarian impact of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which we heard about from our well-informed briefer, and I would like to thank USG Martin Griffith for his briefing. Excellencies, let me concentrate today on the following 3 points. Firstly, Russia has been waging its war of aggression against Ukraine and Ukrainian people for close to 500 days now, and its human and material tolls keep growing with every one of them. As the Russian military fails on the battleground, it tries to compensate for its shortcomings there with continuous brutal aggression against the innocent civilians. Air raid sirens keep blaring across the whole Ukraine. Critical infrastructure facilities remain the primary targets of the Russian rockets. New civilian deaths are being continuously reported. All this bears the characteristic of a total war, and as such requires repeated universal condemnation time and time again. My second point refers to the Russian strategy here at the United Nations. Despite the fact that the vast majority of the UN member states have been crystal clear in their condemnation of the Russian aggression and its disastrous humanitarian impact on numerous occasions, Russia keeps ignoring our appeals, distorting the basic facts even today, and flooding us with disinformation and propaganda about this special military operation. Their hope is that the international community will eventually become tired with this war. That we will stop talking about it, and that we will eventually forget about it. My appeal to you today is simple. Let us never be indifferent. Let us never get used to war, to any war, even if it disappears from the breaking news headlines. As long as the Ukrainians keep paying the highest price, heroically defending each square kilometer of its territory against the invading forces, we cannot let our resolve falter. We need to stand our ground and continue to defend the UN Charter. We need to keep putting pressure on Russia to cease its aggression. When there is no aggression, there is no war. So that's the way to achieve peace the whole world looks forward to. Finally, we should keep helping Ukraine on the ground as long as it takes. In 2022, the total value of support for Ukraine from Poland amounted to about $10 billion. This year, the expenditure only to cover the social benefits and educational needs of Ukrainians, mostly women and children, finding refuge in Poland, will amount to another $1.2 billion. In the face of the systemic Russian attacks aimed at destroying energy and heating infrastructure during the past winter, our humanitarian assistance focused on spare parts and equipment for the energy infrastructure, as well as transformers and power and aggregates. We will continue with our support for Ukraine, both here in the United Nations and on the ground, as long as it is necessary. We will not get worn down in our solidarity with Ukraine by Russian hybrid attacks on Poland, which are upscaling recently. And we call upon all member states to do the same. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Pologne de sa déclaration et j'invite maintenant le représentant de la Lituanie.
I thank you, Madam President. I'm speaking on behalf of the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and my own country, Lithuania. We fully align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. I also thank the Undersecretary General Martin Griffiths for his comprehensive briefing. We highly value the work of the United Nations in their efforts to provide humanitarian aid to people affected by Russia's unprovoked and premeditated war against Ukraine, as well as in their close monitoring and documentation of human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. We also appreciate their active engagement in the numerous diplomatic efforts, including the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Over the past 15 months, Russia has inflicted immense suffering upon Ukraine and its people through its full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine. The humanitarian consequences of Russia's attacks on the civilian population have been devastating. Each additional day of aggression prolongs the toll of the human suffering. Russia, responding to its military losses in Ukraine, is terrorizing the civilian population by conducting massive missile and UAV strikes at critical infrastructure and residential areas, including in Kiev and Odessa. These horrific attacks, which result in significant casualties and destruction, are designed to erode the will of ordinary Ukrainians to resist. However, launching attacks with the sole purpose of terrorizing civilians is a war crime. Madam President, the UN and the OSCE have published extensive reports indicating atrocities committed by Russia and its armed forces against civilians in Ukraine. These acts have been classified as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and gross violations of the Geneva Conventions. We highlight the large-scale attempts by Russia to abduct and transfer children from Ukraine. International humanitarian law must be upheld collectively, with international organizations leading the way. The recent arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court for Russia's President Vladimir Putin and Presidential Commissioner for Children's Rights in Russia, Maria Lvova-Belova, the OSCE's Moscow mechanism, mission of experts on the situation of Ukrainian children, and the United Nations High Commissioner's Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine are all concrete steps towards accountability and safeguarding the international humanitarian law. We strongly condemn Russia's attempt to intimidate the ICC and undermine international efforts to secure justice. Madam President, on May 8th, Russian strikes destroyed 1,000 square meters of humanitarian aid stored in the large warehouse of Ukrainian Red Cross for the Odessa region. By attacking agricultural infrastructure and restricting maritime exports, Moscow seeks to instrumentalize the vulnerabilities of other countries. It is estimated that Ukrainian agricultural products feed 400 million people around the world. Despite the full-blown war on its territory, Ukraine remains one of the world's top 5 agricultural exporters. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, the grain from Ukraine, and the EU Solidarity Lines have played an instrumental role in this by alleviating the global food crisis, severely exacerbated by Russia's illegal war of aggression. If Russia were serious about countering food insecurity, it would stop its threats to unilaterally leave the Black Sea Grain Initiative and put an end to delaying the inspection of vessels. The Baltic states are making significant diplomatic efforts to support Ukraine, providing humanitarian, economic, and military aid. Together with Poland, we are among top 4 bilateral aid donors to Ukraine as a percentage of our GDPs. It is important to recall that all the support being provided to Ukraine is in addition to rather than at the expense of aid and development cooperation to other countries around the world. Madam President, Russia must realize that it cannot win in Ukraine. Ultimately, it is Ukraine that will prevail. With unwavering support from the international community, Ukraine will continue to demonstrate its remarkable courage, determination, and moral strength at its fights to liberate its homeland. A peace will be achieved when Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence are fully restored, enabling its people to thrive and prosper. We reiterate our support for President Zelensky's efforts to promote a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, in line with the UN Charter. And we support the basic principles outlined in his peace initiative. We are committed to upholding Putin's criminal regime accountable for the war of aggression unleashed against Ukraine. We, the international community, must unite and commit ourselves to ensure the full accountability for the core international crimes in connection with Russia's war against Ukraine, including through the establishment of a special international tribunal for the prosecution of crimes of aggression. The full version of the statement will be provided to the members of the Security Council in written. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de la Lituanie et je passe la parole au représentant du Danemark.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and then, of course, my own country, Denmark. The Nordics are committed to the protection of civilians in armed conflict as a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. Globally and at the country level, in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, the Americas, and Europe, our commitment to humanitarian action is resolute. I want to take this opportunity to thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths for his briefing and for the work of OCHA's staff, along with the staff of other UN agencies and other humanitarian actors who do humanitarian work around the clock under impossible conditions in Ukraine and elsewhere. Now, for more than a year now, Ukraine has been bravely resisting a brutal war of aggression initiated by Russia. The devastating consequences of the war also reach beyond Ukrainian borders to the Horn of Africa, Yemen, and beyond, where millions of people have been pushed deeper into food insecurity due to rising food and energy prices across the world. Russia's war against Ukraine has compounded many global challenges, making it an urgent matter of international peace and security, and obviously a matter of concern to all member states. Madam President, Russia's indiscriminate missile attacks across Ukrainian cities continue to cause harm to civilians and severe damage to civilian property and infrastructure, illustrating Russia's complete disregard for international humanitarian law. The consequences of these brutal attacks are extensive and far-reaching, and the situation is especially dire close to the front lines, where the need for protection and humanitarian assistance, such as food, medicines, and shelter, is alarmingly high. For many, the consequences of the war are long-lasting, damaging the very foundation for recovery and healing, both at the personal and at the societal level. In this regard, the Nordics welcome the establishment of a register of damage, documenting claims of damage caused by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, as recommended by the UN General Assembly in its resolutions ES 11/5. Madam President, delivering humanitarian assistance in Ukraine to those in need is difficult and dangerous. The situation is a horrific reminder of the need to ensure protection for all civilians. Under international humanitarian law, civilians and civilian objects must be protected, and humanitarian access must have full, safe, and unhindered access. And we condemn in the strongest terms attacks on humanitarian operations, such as the attacks on a Ukrainian Red Cross warehouse in Odessa and on medical facilities in Mykolaiv on 8th of May. And we call on Russia to allow full, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian actors. Madam President, further to the tragic consequences for people in Ukraine, Russia's illegal invasion has had catastrophic global effects. The worsening food crisis and the volatility of global food and energy prices have impacted countries around the world. The World Food Programme estimates that an astounding 345 million people will experience acute food insecurity this year. This is the equivalent of more than the entire population of the United States of America. The world's poorest and those in the most vulnerable situations tend to be the ones most affected by such crises. As a result, the need for humanitarian assistance globally has increased, and at the same time, food assistance and humanitarian operations have become more expensive, exacerbating the gap between humanitarian needs and available funding. Madam President, until Russia ends its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, the continuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative remains imperative to avoid a worsening of the global food crisis. Up until earlier this month, the initiative had ensured the export of as much as 30 million tons of grains and foodstuff, thereby helping to stabilize global food prices and allowing access to food for people at risk of famine. We welcome the active engagement by the Secretary General and Turkey and urge Russia to ensure a long-term rollover of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in line with the Istanbul Agreement and to immediately suspend its military operations. The extension and full implementation of this initiative is critical in order to avoid a further deterioration of the global food crisis. Madam President, let me conclude by saying the Nordics will continue to stand with Ukraine and its people, and we commend Ukraine's initiative for a just peace and support the various initiatives that are seeking accountability for international crimes committed in connection with Russia's aggression against Ukraine. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Danemark de sa déclaration. Il n'y a plus d'oratrices ou d'orateurs inscrits sur la liste. La séance est donc levée.